It's taking a while to record here.
I've still got the record button on the top left.
Yeah, it hasn't gone red for me yet. There we go. Welcome to Coffee, Eggs and Inspiration. It's a weekly show that goes out over YouTube and as a podcast over all of the major channels. And each week I get to sit with an inspiring person and listen to them tell their story and share it with all of you. This week is no different. I'm joined by Jake Lazarus. Welcome, Jake.
Hiya. Morning.
Good morning, good morning. It's actually pretty early in the morning. It's 8 a.m. as we're filming at the moment. So Jake's very graciously joined me at this hour of the day. Jake is the co-founder of Keakie, which is a new music streaming platform, aiming to be in the top 5 streaming platforms in the world. It's a different type of proposition though, aimed at lateral music discovery. So think music organized around genres into mixes, which Jake believes and his team believes is the next form of playlist. So places like Spotify and Apple Music will assemble a playlist that sort of gives you more of what you already like, whereas the idea of Keakie is to help you discover music around the edges of the stuff that you like and take you into new places. Really interesting. I'm a subscriber myself. Not that there's a subscription free, it's a free service, and it's super interesting. I do suggest it. So Masters of Niche launched during lockdown, 400,000 plus users in less than a month. So there's quite a few people out there that agree with Jake and his team on the hypothesis that this is good. This is actually Jake's third startup. The first was an internet radio, which built to one of the biggest, or I think the biggest teen radio stations in the world. Jake's now out of that business, having successfully grown it. His next business was a direct social media marketing company. So he's in TikTok and other forms of social media, and now Keakie. So wonderful, innovative track record at a young age. Let's talk about the difference between a playlist and a mix, and tell us a little bit more about your philosophy with Keakie. Thanks.
Yeah, I think the way that we've been viewing it, and the way that people have been viewing it for the last 10 years, but on the fringes, is that the evolution of music has been from single track to, EP to album, and then it was the playlist. And each time you're getting further and further away from the artist. The control is getting into the hand of labels, and now it's in the hands of playlisters and the DSPs. We think the evolution of that is the mix format, because not only are you getting more of a live experience with the tracks blended into each other, but you're also experiencing music in the way that the creator intended. You're getting things like context. When you are on a playlist and you press shuffle, there is no context, there's no order, there's no build up, there's no start and end. And so it's really the shuffling of playlists that I think has really left music for the worse. And so what we've done and what we will continue to do is find the best curators of music, be those DJs, radio presenters, archivists, collectivists, and get them to put together songs that they think work really well together and blend them in using DJ equipment. And so what you end up with is an hour, 2 hours long experience that isn't the kind of fragmented back and forth, stop and start of a playlist, but it's so much more immersive. And I think at a time where pretty much the live music industry is a non-starter for at least this year, if not the next year, it's certainly a way of keeping that, keeping people engaged in music, and really letting people access new stuff that they haven't really heard before. So I think it's a no-brainer for the mix format. I don't think it's going to replace the playlist, but certainly I think the playlist has had its day in a lot of ways.
So in a way, I've been listening to some of your mixes this morning on Keakie. There's no shuffle function as such. You tune in, you listen to a volume, and in some of them there's an introduction from the the producer or the mixer at the start, and it just takes you on a journey in that sense. Who's your, how do you imagine your listener? I mean, you talked about a 1 or 2 hour session. What is your ideal listener? What are they doing and how are they listening? When are they listening?
So I think our plan with this is to really cater to how the normal teenager, 16 to 24-year-old being our key demographic, how they engage with music. So we haven't really got a favorite type of listener, although I'll go into how we internally rank listeners, which I think may be interesting for your audience. But what we want to do is for the platform to represent how people listen to music in real life. And so if you are on, I mean, SoundCloud's a good example. SoundCloud have a playlist called Sleep, and they have one called Party, and they have one called Run. And most of our audience aren't really using music in that way. It's far more nuanced. It's music to get in the bath into, music, you know, before you're going out, or the music when you've had the party and come back for an after party. It's music to run to, it's music to go to the gym to. There's thousands of different activities and different contexts that people want to listen to music. There's a mixture of active and passive, but no platform has done it properly to give you music for whatever activity or whatever mood or mindset you are in. And we're still a long way off doing this, but that's really our ultimate aim. So the types of listeners that you have 2 core types and a third type coming in. The third type is really a nostalgic listener. We're seeing a slightly older demographic, around 30 to 50, using the platform and re-engaging with genres that they really haven't listened to for a long time. Normally the drum and bass, the rave stuff, some garage, some R&B from the 90s. And most of these listeners really listen to radio. So they couldn't tell you the name of all the tracks, but they know that they like a certain DJ or a certain sound. So the nostalgic listeners really is an interesting area that we hadn't really anticipated for. And we've certainly got lots of investors who fall into that category, which is always good news. But the first and second really is someone who knows exactly what they're looking for, is like a diehard fan of a certain genre. So I'm a massive techno fan, as an example. And I go on the site, I know exactly what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a very specific type of techno that I like to sink my teeth into. The other type of listener is just the curious, someone who doesn't really know too much about music, but is open to suggestion. These are the kind of the friends that you drag along to festivals, people that listen to radio. So that's really our 3 primary audiences. And there's always some overlap, but we're seeing some really interesting trends appearing between which genres are doing best with which types of audience.
I would say I probably flip between nostalgic and curious, and love to be introduced. You know, I feel like I don't have the time to just graze and happen across stuff. So I kind of get it. I like the proposition a lot. Let's talk about from an artist point of view. So if you're a musician, a DJ, a mixer, a beat producer, what's the advantage of being on Keakie and versus a Spotify or an Apple Music, etc.?
Yeah, so I think what we're providing for artists is an entirely different package to what you are getting on a major DSP. When we're certainly smaller than pretty much all of the major DSPs, and so we're not able to offer, you know, the promise of gold in the same way that other platforms are. So we offer a rate which is higher than the major DSPs. It's about 3 times higher than Spotify's per stream. But at the streams that we're experiencing currently, and at the streams a lot of independent artists are getting, it's a bit of a false promise to pretend that you're gonna, you know, this is gonna change your life from a financial perspective. And so what we've done is shifted really our marketing to artists and our value proposition away from that. It's still providing, you know, money as a minimum, as a point of fairness, but really focusing on the creative side, giving them full creative freedom, giving them visual assets, basically providing a lot of the support that a major label would provide, including marketing, potentially marketing spend, to really give independent artists and DJs, etc., a much bigger support package. Most of our artists, particularly on the DJ side, are not signed to any labels or any management companies. And so our offer is really to provide a lot of help, expertise where, you know, that may be inaccessible to them. It extends, again, we've got 3 recording studios now in London. We rent them out for free. So if you have a show with us, you're able to use them. I think they're all in Shoreditch currently. We've got one in New York coming soon. So you're basically, you're part of the family, and if you're working with us, the interest for us is to give the artist as much exposure as possible to the right crowd, and that's really what we're attempting to do. I think the only additional thing to mention is a lot of what we would call an artist is much broader than a traditional idea of someone who sings or produces. If you're a DJ, the other platforms don't really cater to your expertise, and there's very few platforms actually monetizing DJ mixes or radio shows. They're monetizing tracks, and so we've got a somewhat broader interpretation of what an artist and creative is. And so when we're talking about artists, it could be a DJ, it could be a radio presenter, it could be someone who has been digging in rare groove for 40 years. It can really, the definition is really so broad that we can encompass large parts of the industry that haven't benefited from the streaming mania. Yeah.
And the a DJ is often sampling. They're taking chunks of other music and stringing them together. Music is a complex place. There are rights all over the place. This must be a licensing nightmare for you. How do you handle that?
Yeah, well, we're both now very familiar with licensing nightmares from previous encounters we've had. But I think we're saved by almost a technicality in the industry, which is radio licensing is significantly easier than single track licensing. And because of mixes, you're not able to change the order of the songs. It's not on demand playback of single tracks. We fall under the PRS and PPL licensing rather than going to each major label and concocting a large legal agreement with them. So we're licensed in the same way that I guess Pandora is or has been in the States, the same way that internet radio is licensed. And so really the rates that you're paying are around the same, but the complexity about reporting is far less. And so you certainly haven't got a lot of the issues around who to pay, which publisher to play, who wrote the song, has the rights been transported, etc. And so for any new streaming platform, it'd always be my recommendation to go with the radio licensing model. If you're doing mixes, you'll eventually have to craft your own deals with the majors, but it provides so much financial and legal overhead that it's very unattainable for most startups to do that.
Interesting. So your Keakie is really positioned as a radio service as opposed to a streaming platform in the traditional sense, and that helps you simplify things. Did I get that right? Yeah.
So we're a radio platform with unlimited channels. I mean that's how it's described. There's still complexities around the licensing framework as to how territories work. You still have that issue. A good example being you're allowed overspill. So our UK license gives us 10% overspill. So that's UK, and then 10% of whatever other country decides to listen. Once a country gets more than 10%, which looks like it's going to be the United States, we've then got to go to their licensing authorities, which is Sound Exchange, to do a deal there. So there is the infrastructure for smaller companies to really dip their toe into radio, where there isn't really the infrastructure to do it with single track licensing.
Interesting. And the rates you pay, I think you mentioned 3 times the rate of Spotify. Spotify, of course, is a subscription service, or mostly a subscription service. Yours is an ads-based model. That's the funding model. I know you have strong views, Jake, about subscription versus ads models. Talk to me about that.
Well, I think subscription models really work where the value proposition is right. So I think Netflix is one of the best platforms to illustrate this. I think Luminary is one of the best examples against this. If you're providing your user with a new experience with so much value, then it makes sense for a subscription service. And there's so many subscription services now. There's one for cheese, one for fish. One came out yesterday for bikes. You can subscribe to have a bike. So it's certainly the way the economy is going. You're not owning anything and you're just renting things forever. I'm against that in some ways, but I see the value that it can bring in opening up new areas of the economy to different parts of society. So conceptually, I think they're great. In this space, I think Luminary has failed remarkably to do it. I think when you've got Spotify for £7 a month or $9 a month, I think it is, it's very difficult for Keakie to match that when we're offering so much less at this current stage. So we've got 450 different creatives signed up. We've got another 200 in the pipeline, but you can't find everything that you want. You can't find every song that exists. And so the value proposition of Spotify, which is every song ever for $9, or Keakie, which is, some songs that we like for $4, doesn't make sense from a price perspective. And so Keakie would have to have every single musical niche covered and such a depth of catalog that you never run out of stuff to listen to before it made sense to do a subscription service. I think people that do services, with average platforms or not enough content are ripping off their end user. The benefit of us going ad funded is entering markets where people cannot afford those subscription services. So there's a big emerging markets play with our catalog. We've got over, I think, 120 hours of content from Africa now. We've got a similar amount from Latin America. And so we're looking to enter these markets where $9 a month would be completely, it's just not feasible for the average person. And that even extends to the data usage. So got quite nerdy about this, been experimenting with low latency streaming, for example. So if you were in parts of Africa, even parts of like Lagos still have pretty spotty internet. Listening to Keakie is not only free to do, but also cheaper on your data bill. And so it's really making us competitive in the markets where a subscription service is hard to enter.
That's a really interesting angle. I know the music scene is vibrant all over Africa. And you mentioned Lagos and Nigeria in particular, 200 million people. And if they like using it, that's a pretty big market. 5 times the size for the UK right there. So interesting stuff. This takes us into the advertising world, and you and I have had past discussions about the future of advertising, and I want to get into that on this discussion. You've come from an influencer marketing background. That was one of your businesses. An influencer marketing is about using the footprint, the social following of an individual, and using that association to pair with a brand in order to reach that audience. And there are many pundits in the industry who believe influencer marketing is the future. It's obviously getting bigger and bigger, and some on the extreme end would say it will eventually eclipse or largely eclipse traditional forms of marketing and advertising. What's your view?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think the picture that you've painted, and the picture that a lot of supposed pundits are painting, I think it's one of the most depressing, like dystopian views of society that you can have. I think people know what an ad is. The ad agencies and brands have attempted to kind of hide them in plain sight. We had sponsored content, which is probably one of the most annoying things on the web. I think it's Tabula, the company that does most of that now. When you're scrolling down an article and you see at the bottom 10 things you wish you knew on a slideshow, and it's just not, you can't even imagine that anyone's paying for that. With influencers, it's kind of the same. It's become very saturated. The end user now knows very well versed in the fact that you are selling something, you are making money off of it. In the early days, if a 16-year-old girl had said, I really like this skincare routine, people wouldn't necessarily have known what the value chain was coming through. Since legislation has changed, you now have to have hashtag ad in there, and everyone's doing it under the sun. I think a big percentage of any particularly young girls' TikTok or Instagram feed is sponsored stuff. Go on TikTok now, Charlie D'Amelio, who is the queen of TikTok, she's doing about 2 or 3 brand partnerships a week. I've seen both Hollister and American Eagle on there now. And so it seems like it's accelerating really quickly. But the question is, number one, what is the conversion? And number 2, it looks like it's just going off a bit of a cliff edge. So I think it has to be about trust with advertising. I think brands have to earn the trust of users back. And I think slipping them in the feeds of 12-year-old girls or 12-year-old boys on TikTok is not necessarily what I would call a trust-based system. I think it's pretty aggressive. I think the tactics involved in the influencer market, you pretty much get away with what you can. You try and find an influencer with no management. You know, people talking about micro influencers or pico influencers. It's massively aggressive, and I think the social effect of that is that eventually you don't really trust anyone. Any of these influencers are just not trusted. You know, you're going to them for their content because you relate to them on a personal level, you're interested in them, or you want to learn from them. But all of those things are now at risk if they're just the mouthpieces of various brands, and not even brands that they like or use, brands that are paying the highest price. And so I'm certainly, having been in the space, I certainly find it somewhat repulsive, I would say. And I think anyone with kids, if they were just watching their kids' TikTok feed for a day and seen the volume of brands attempting to reach them in quite sneaky ways, I think there would be a far bigger public backlash against influencer marketing. I've even seen one, I think it's the company Daz, which I think someone's told me is a washing product, doing a campaign on TikTok trying to reach 10-year-olds. There's something about that just seems a little bit off for me.
I think the brief that you've leveled there. So I take it your view is that actually the future of advertising is advertising in the more traditional sense, as in a brand message delivered in the context or in the stream of other content that a user is enjoying. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think on the fundamentals, the future of advertising is advertising. You know, it's traditional advertising. The TV format works really well. I think the TV, the TV listening numbers or viewing numbers is obviously declining, particularly amongst the 16 and 24s. But the video on demand advertising is alive and kicking. There's just so much more you can do when the brand is going directly to the user. Even something like a click through. If you're doing an influencer campaign, the biggest issue is, what's the conversion? You can't click through on a TikTok video. You can't even click through on an Instagram story until you have 10,000 followers. So there's so many. The industry is basically a hack. The influencer industry is a hack around user-generated content. If you were a brand trying to get conversions, you'd want someone to be able to actually click on it and go where you want them to go. And I think an interesting development on TikTok is now that brands are advertising in TikTok directly. I've seen Apple in there. I've seen Deliveroo in there. I've even seen the government's NHS track and trace program in there, which was probably the first time I actually felt proud to be part of the UK. It's very rare that the British government is ahead of the curve on any kind of advertising standards, if anything at all. So, there's brands going directly to TikTok. Instagram's been doing it for a while now. I think that is a far better way for brands to reach the user base. You don't even want to get into the discussion about fake numbers or fake shares or the kind of darker side of Instagram. In particular, I think that the stat that I've seen recently is about 25% of all followers aren't real. So brands really paying through the nose to reach people that are either uninterested or don't exist.
So if we come back to advertising in the traditional sense, and I'm gonna play devil's advocate rather paradoxically here, because I happen to work at Google, which earns a lot of its money from advertising, and YouTube in particular is exactly that, the form that you describe. It's an in-stream, either skippable or unskippable brand advert. It strikes me that the traditional form of advertising is essentially tolerated interruption. It's an understood trade-off. People don't go and watch TV or YouTube or any other video on demand platform to see the ads. Most don't anyway. They understand though, as part of that deal, they will see ads, and hopefully if the algorithms are working well, those ads will be very relevant to what they're interested in.
Yeah, I think it's a good way of viewing it. It's almost, if you look at like the original philosophies behind government, it's a necessary evil. You need to, the content that you're viewing needs to be funded somehow, and you're not paying for it, so someone has to pay for it. So I think it's been seen as a necessary evil. I think and I'm not really in the interest of slighting the glorious overlords that are Google in too much detail. I think this is going out on YouTube. But one of the things that they don't do so well is the frequency of adverts. And you end up, you want to watch a video and you get 2 or 3 adverts before you can get to the content. And that normally leads to me and a lot of the user base to kind of disengage. So it's definitely a balancing act in terms of the frequency of the advertising. And I think certain platforms are trying to push, for their margins and their profitability. What Keakie is certainly looking to do is to have a maximum amount of adverts per hour. I think it's about 5 times less than what YouTube is having currently. So we'd obviously like to make more money. We'd like to give our creatives more money. But certainly we don't want to annoy our entire user base. And so there's certainly a fine line between what people are willing to kind of sit through and engage with and what they're not. And it really falls into 2 parts, whether it's number 1, the frequency of ads, and number 2, how targeted they are. You need to get both right before the advertising experience can work. If a brand I'm interested in is advertising to me, it can be a value add even. I think people forget that it can enhance the experience to some extent if done properly. But I think it's kind of been ruined by a lot of people not doing it properly, and somewhat getting a bit of a bad name.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. So, advertising can be not a tolerated interruption, but a welcome interruption and even a value add. If it's well targeted, it's highly relevant, it's creatively awesome, it's interesting and stimulating to watch or listen to. And, I think that probably is the evolution and future of advertising. I know. Thank you for your feedback on frequency at YouTube. We love feedback. I'll pass that back.
Yeah.
But we found in the early days of YouTube, for example, you can't just port a 30-second commercial from TV over to a video on demand platform and expect it to work in the same way. It's kind of like radio with pictures. But a 6-second bumper ad, that sort of skips you, delivers a quick message and then takes you straight to the content, works quite well. And, we're certainly still learning, and I think brands are too. Fascinating views.
I think just on that quickly, there's something that I was chatting with one of our brand partners with yesterday on this front, which I think might be the evolution of that, which is sequential advertising. So it's tough to distill a brand message into 6 seconds, although doable. But if you've got your 6-second ad, and the next time you came back, you'd get a sequential, the next 6 seconds of it. Could be a really interesting way to re-engage users. So that's something that we're looking at really closely.
Sort of serialized, you can choose to flip into the next one. That's interesting view. We talked a little bit about TikTok already. Obviously some controversy playing out in the US at the moment. I don't want to get into the politics of it, but it's clear that with the looming ban of TikTok and WeChat, the ecosystem is evolving rapidly. What are your observations on the sort of ecosystem? Do you think about the big social islands, the video on demand platforms, the music platforms? How's it all changing from your perspective?
Yeah, I think there's two points to it, and without going too deep into the politics, the banning of a social media platform or the forced sale of it is really worrying from an entrepreneurial perspective. The reason people build things in the United States, I mean, apart from the access to cash, is the legal framework and the willingness of a government to embrace technological innovation. And I think this is definitely sending the wrong signal, and certainly falling into the same trap that China have been doing with their people in the United States. Many people, even in the Trump government, who have derided the firewall that Trump has put up, that China has put up, and then basically doing the exact same thing. So I think it really sends a really negative signal to most of the technology industry. And I'm certainly surprised at how quiet a lot of the US tech industry has been about this. certainly when they are getting this kind of treatment in China, they are, they are up in arms about it. So I think it's a negative. It's a really worrying trend. I think off of the politics and onto the platforms. It's an interesting one. Most platforms really start with a clear goal. You mentioned earlier before this call, Instagram being really for photographers. Initially Facebook was a way to connect with your friends, if you remember those days when people did that. TikTok initially, if you look at what Musical.ly was prior to being acquired, it was a way to dance, to lip sync to a certain track. Twitch started pretty much as a gaming live streaming thing. All of these companies are now, very far from where they started. You've got musical acts now using Twitch. Instagram is just everything. TikTok is now everything. Facebook is actually everything. I think there's pretty much everything on Facebook. Not that any of our demographic would be using it. So I think when you've got that kind of cycle where something starts with a single purpose and then keeps expanding, probably to acquire user base, probably to, please investor bases, you end up having opportunities to try and satisfy what that platform initially was set up for. And so I would not be surprised if you start seeing more photography-based social media springing up because Instagram is so convoluted. That would seem to make sense to me. And from a music perspective, there are certainly there are existing platforms who have attempted to do what Keakie has done from a mix perspective, and due to investor pressure or chasing user bases, have widened themselves. So Mixcloud being a good example. Mixcloud is now the home of long form audio, which means quite a lot of things. And so when a big player goes very broad, there's room for smaller players to really own the original niche that they were formed for. I think that's a really interesting play. That if you're a young entrepreneur or you're a startup looking at the spaces, the best spaces to look at are the spaces vacated by the larger players. And that's traditionally how I've picked markets to enter, because the market's already validated. If you were to set up a photography-based social media, it works because Instagram's done it. I think VS Co has also tried to do it. So the foundations work. So it's really just a marketing play, and so it's a really interesting time for ecosystems. And I think I read a really interesting article about some of them being too big to fail. Certainly Facebook being so big that it's really tough to see how, what the ramifications would be for it to fail. But certainly seeing a few of these platforms being rolled up into each other will leave a bit more space. There's a lot of pressure from a music artist or even a user to be, to have so many accounts and everything. And that certainly seems unsustainable to keep the user's attention on 10 plus different platforms. So I think you'll see a few of them merging. I think you'll see a few of them dying and a lot more niche ones coming onto the market, which I think is really, really interesting.
It's very interesting to hear your analysis. And, so what started as sort of quite distinct and separate islands have become increasingly merged, and that creates both overlap and lacunas, gaps that others can move into. It strikes me as one gap that hasn't yet been filled that I've seen anyway. You may have a view on this. Is the intersection of social and music, by which I mean in music, mostly it's a push system. Music is produced, it's made available on digital streaming platforms and platforms like YouTube, and then it's consumed. But there's not a lot going back the other way in terms, there's some community, feedback and so on. But the production of music, is not yet, as far as I've seen, crowdsourced or socially sourced in that sense. It's socially consumed, but not socially produced. What's your view on that? Do you think I'm right or wrong?
I think it's certainly an interesting angle. I've always, I for one, have never been a fan of social media. I'm not really a user of social media, and I kind of get too nerdy into the kind of psychology and user experience of it. So I'm probably not the best person to ask in terms of whether I think it will work, because I'm not naturally of that world. The things that I've done in music have on purpose been on the other side of the social spectrum. There's been a few different companies that have tried to socialize music. I think the people that have done it best have just been the comment section. SoundCloud used to be the place for social listening. It had this great feature called Groups, which everyone who we chat with from a producer perspective loves, that they killed a few years ago for undisclosed reasons. So the comment section on YouTube for certain creatives and on SoundCloud really was the place where social interaction was happening. And if you, on SoundCloud, you could put up just a half finished beat and people could comment on it and give their feedback, and you could kind of take that feedback and go off with it. So there is a precedent for social interaction with producers and in different elements of the production process. I think a few companies have tried to bring the fan and the artist closer together, and they've always ended up being fairly convoluted. I think Scooter Braun gave it a go a few years ago with a company called Backstage, which seemed to really miss the mark, I would say, although I wasn't a particularly avid user of it. So if someone like that is trying to get behind it and putting Justin Bieber on there and it's not working, I'd suggest that it's an interesting challenge, maybe. I think music production is quite a skilled profession, and so whether like a layman is able to properly interact with that process, I think would require some new technology that I've not seen that exists yet. So you'd have to make it accessible to a layman before there could really be true fan engagement, although you could have collaboration. And I think an interesting thing that I'm looking for, if you talk to our design team, the talk of the town is Figma, which, just for the audience if you don't know what Figma is a design tool that has replaced Sketch. So if you're trying to design an interface or an experience, you typically had used Sketch. And now Figma is the same as Sketch, but it's online and in sync. The reason this is relevant is I would like to see a production tool go cloud-based and in the web, so that multiple people could work on a file at the same time without having to be sending files across and versioning. If someone could pull that off, then I think certainly a collaborative production tool would be possible.
Well, it's absolutely fascinating as ever to talk to you, Jake. I really love the way that you think about the industry from a technology point of view, also from a music point of view. I'll leave the final word to you. There's people watching, I'm sure, who are coming out of school or maybe coming out of university, budding entrepreneurs, perhaps people later in their career or at a career pivot. With all of your experience so far as an entrepreneur, what advice would you have for them?
Yeah, I think I've given this answer before, and I wasn't very eloquent with that, but I think the advice is just to not take people's advice on it. There's so much literature and narrative about what to do, what not to do. This is how you set up a company. This is the skills that you need. If you look across any startup, everyone has a different story. Everyone has a different thing that they do good and things that they're not so good at. The real thing would be to make yourself really valuable. So whether that's just getting really good at a specific skill, and then bunching together with co-founders who augment your skill set, I think that's the best way of doing things. If everyone looking for that that secret sauce or that golden bullet, I'm afraid it doesn't exist. I've never met a founder who had the same skill set that I had, and I've never met two founders with the same skill set or same interests. I think it's a bit of a falsehood to suggest that there's a personality type that is being an entrepreneur. So I think the best advice is really just to focus on what you're interested in. Find a gap in the market that people aren't doing. If you look at a platform or you look at a service and you wonder, why do they do it this way? It doesn't make sense. That's really your call to arms, really, as an entrepreneur. Finding the beauty in tearing something apart and then rebuilding it from scratch. So I think that's probably the best feedback. The best inspirational message I can give is probably just to ignore all inspirational messages and just get on with what you're interested in and what you're doing already.
Don't take people's advice. Focus on what you're interested in. Find a gap, pull it apart, put it back together. There's no golden bullet. Provocative as ever, inspirational as ever. Jake Lazarus, thanks so much for joining me.
Cheers, Craig. Thanks very much. It's been interesting.